was educated as a fine art painter.
Good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch,
When she was in
broadcasting
her
pretty much from
20s,
Mansion House in Mexico,
she
working on oil painting Old
experienced
Tree
a moment
B.
of the new completely unaided by
I
any
had to go into town
psychedelic.
today, and
But had
the
an
oranges
experience
and
with lying in a
reds and
field
crimsons of all the
in
leaves
the
are
southeastern
starting to
part of
jump out very
Ontario, where she grew up,
nicely.
that she felt a
So,
moment as if
in
the
keeping with
boundaries
this for
between
a
the
seasonal
field
sort
and
of
the land
theme,
around
with
her
these
and
tree
her own
studies, I'm
being
going
had
to do
collapsed.
this one up with
And that
more
there was
variety
a
of
unity,
reds
there was a profound
and
unity
fall
that the
coloration,
world and the
as well
forest
as the
and
deep
the land
greens
were literally
and gold
inside of
greens.
her.
So I mixed up a palette of red ochre, pure
And this
red, red
became,
orange,
in a
magenta,
sense, the object of her own vision. It became
a
something that she
violet,
chose
magenta,
to
white
pursue
mix.
with
So
her
kind of
own
a variety of
artistic
warmer
intent.
tones to start brightening this up with.
And she
So I'm
began
just
to
going to play with
paint.
those for a little while.
And so she would paint
26.
forest. She'd paint forest scenes that had a particular quality to them. People saw it as being almost a very spiritual quality in her painting, without being completely sort of explicit. They had an inner beauty. Things happened. She moves to Montreal, and she ends up being one of the founders of a company that was called Softimage. Softimage was the first computer graphics, 3D computer graphics software company. And over the years she worked at Softimage. In the beginning it was a startup, so she did what she needed to. She wrote the manuals, she did some marketing, they got some financing, and the software became the software that's used in most films today for computer graphics. But she never left her artistic intent, and so when they were working on the software, she would play with it, in part to test it, but in part to see if her own sensibilities of the world as she understood them as a painter could be represented in this medium. And so she'd say, why can't I do this? Why can't I make this object look translucent? Why can't I make it look translucent and color it with different light sources? And in part, the reason that we can see Titanic and Armageddon on the big screen and have them be believable is because somewhere back there was an artist who was measuring everything against an interior sense of fidelity and making things look real. Well, the company grows up. It's a $100 million company, and she's allowed then to move and become her own role, Director of Visual Research, which doesn't really mean anything. It means she can do as she pleases because the company's been a success, so she has free time. And the first thing that she did was design something that she called a light box, which could take a static image because, in fact, unless you're using cinema film at that point in time, the only way you could get a 3D graphics image was to print it on a sheet of paper. In this case, she did it on a sheet of cellulose. And she would create these constructions that looked like huge, organic, almost gel-like fans floating in the seawater with light suffused in them. And no one in the world of computer graphics had ever seen anything come out of a computer that looked so organic and looked like it had grown, really almost like a photograph. But this was the beginning of her quest, using now technology as a means to represent. And she did a series of these, won some awards. They've been shown at major art festivals, at SIGGRAPH, things like this. And she began to establish a reputation. Well, time goes on, and as we know, computers get faster and stronger and better. And she began to really have a desire to have one of these works be real. She's making these works in the sense that they're three-dimensional, but she can't show them to people that way. But all of a sudden, graphics supercomputers are available, and they're only a few $100,000, and there are several of them all across the building she's working in, because this is the place where they make the software for the movies. And so she starts on another project, and she decides she's going to make one of these light boxes that she can walk into. And now she's confronted not just with the artistic intent, but she's also confronted with the reality of immersion in the virtual world. And she took a look at immersion as it was understood in the early 1990s. And she saw that most people moved in the virtual world by one of two mechanisms, one of which was using the data glove and pointing in the virtual world, which is, in fact, not particularly intuitive, somewhat cumbersome, and actually, if you leave your arm out there for a while, it gets tired. It's just a biological reality. The second one of which was the joystick, and she never thought the joystick was natural, and I remarked to her one day, that's because you're not a man. It's the most natural. It's the most natural movement in the world to a man. And she laughed. And I actually do think there's some reality to that. She was looking for an interface. And she was looking for an interface that could bring the physical reality of the body into cyberspace. Well, it was just the point in her life when she was learning how to scuba dive. Now, for those of you who don't, and I don't, but I've heard a lot of description of it, a scuba diver maneuvers in the boundless three-dimensional space underneath the water. So you think about it, humans really only move in 2 dimensions, right? We really only move about, we don't move up and down. But a diver moves in 3 dimensions by controlling the buoyancy of their body. And they control the buoyancy of their body by controlling the amount of air in their lungs. As you inflate your chest with air, your buoyancy changes to be less than water and you rise. And as you exhale, you fall. And so she constructed not a $1 trillion apparatus, but a simple band that goes around your chest that simply measures your chest extension. It's $5 in components. And poof, all of a sudden, you've invented an interface to the virtual world that isn't based on anything that's unnatural, but on the most innate of all actions, which is breathing. So that in the virtual world that she created to float up, you go, and you rise gently, and to float down, you exhale. To move forward, you lean gently forward. To move backward, you lean gently backward and side to side. The power that this had was to bring the embodied being into the virtual world, because you cannot leave your body behind inside of her work. Your body is intimate, even though it is not represented. Your body is intimately present inside the work. And so the drive to sort of tear behind and leave the meat down on Earth as you explore the wilds of cyberspace, was completely circumvented. It was short-circuited, because what it showed was that the presence of the body made cyberspace more effective, more powerful, more seductive. Well, there's the interface, but what did she put inside of it? What she chose to do in this work was to create an evocation of the natural world. And she created a piece that's called osmose, which is the French word for osmosis, to flow between. And in this world, or actually a collection of worlds, there are 10 different spaces, and the main space has a large tree that's simply represented. And you can flow around this tree, you can flow up into the leaves of this tree, you can flow into a single leaf of a tree, and particle systems will animate beams of light representing perhaps the flows of energy within a single leaf of the tree. You can float over to a glade, you can flow down a brook, you can fall into beneath the surface of the earth and see the strata of rocks and stones that are underneath. Now the thing of it is that as a painter she understood that in fact we do not see the real world as a collection of bright neon hard-edged objects, that in fact the scientific evocation of the virtual world as being a collection of objects that are black, burped up from the void, sitting there and glowing, has nothing to do with our own real experience. So every single object in osmose, and there are 5,000 of them or something, are transparent to different degrees. So that the effect that you get as you look at any of the objects in this world is indistinct, it's indeterminate. Everything is between, it's liminal in an absolute sense. Well, people really liked the work when she was testing it, and it had set a gallery date. It was going to be shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, which is in fact where I saw it a few weeks later. People would go into the system, they'd cruise around. Now imagine they're wearing a head-mounted display, quite a large one, and it's about 20 pounds, and that places a considerable torque on the neck, and you also sweat a lot, and it's sort of stuffy, and people just wouldn't get out of it. Because what they were seeing and what they were experiencing was so unique. And it wasn't a silent world, and I want to stress this, that in fact the sound was there, and the sound was a male and a female human voice that was processed any number of different ways, and it wasn't pre-planned. It was based on where you were and what you were doing. So you'd hear a chorus of different voices and sounds as you passed through the world doing different things. We're a week away from the exhibition day, and on average, people have been spending 40 minutes in the work. Well, to show a work like this in a gallery, and you only have one supercomputer and one head-mounted display, you need to be able to get people in and out at 15-minute intervals. 5 minutes to get them in, 15 minutes in it, 5 minutes to get the next person in. You can do 3 people an hour that way. So she needed to create an artificial end. And so what she did is that after about 14 and a half minutes, you find yourself now gently floating above the main world of the single tree in the glade, and the world itself is encased in a partially translucent crystalline sphere. And you pull away from it into blackness. That's when people started coming out of the work crying. People started to write in the book that they weren't sure they were afraid of death anymore. That this reminded them of something so nearly nothing so much as a near-death experience. That in fact this longing and this leaving of the world was inducing a state that could really only be called profoundly religious. And it's funny because when I tell some people this, they laugh as if it were impossible for a work of electronic art or a work of virtual art to induce this response in people. But then I ask them, if you go into Chartres Cathedral, if you go into Notre Dame, don't you then experience this sort of opening? Whether or not you believe the creed, the space itself is constructed in such a way that it really has this profound effect on you. And I think what Shaw has done in that work is really find some way to an opening to something that's inside of us, something that's very evocative of us, evocative to us of the sacred. And that wasn't her intent. It's a byproduct of her artistic vision. She took a break because that was a lot of work. She got a lot of flack from the electronic art community because the old school in electronic art thinks that if it's pretty, it's not valuable. If it's not making a statement about the war in Bosnia, it's worthless. If it's not politically strident, it's pointless. She didn't care. She had achieved her goals. And people were still reporting the intense beauty of the work. If you go and read her logbooks from people who write their comments after they've been in. But Osmos was a period of longing for her. She'd been in a very long-term relationship. Her life was just basically on the rocks at the time, and so the work was emotionally evocative of this. 2 years later, she comes back, and she's in a very different frame of mind. And she realizes that what she wants to do is start to use this mechanism and this interface to explore a joyous experience. And she went into the lab for another year. And just last month, at the National Gallery in Canada, a successor work, I think of them as complements, was created called Ephemer, the ephemera or ephemeral. And this work uses precisely the same interface, so you are embodied in the work, but the subject, the content is entirely different. When you enter it, you see a sea of stars, and these stars begin to move and float down, and as they do, the light rises on what looks like nothing so much as an antique Chinese watercolor. Trees almost as single straight lines falling down to a glade that's covered in snow, and the stars become falling snowflakes. And you can stay in this environment, and as time passes, the sun rises and sets, the moon rises and sets, and then, as the sun rises in the next day, the only way I can describe it is as if Monet's God has been loosed in the world. Because all of a sudden the forest floor becomes this writhing sea of purple and yellow, and all the colors the trees and living things are before the chlorophyll comes alive in them. And you look up into the trees and you see these great sheets of color waving around. And it's not what a forest looks like, it's what a forest feels like. And she says her influence is Joseph Turner, who's the great oil painter from the last century, in the fact that his bold strokes of color that are all very indistinct and still incredibly evocative powered her in this environment. And you can follow this forest through its 4 seasons, but you can also also allow yourself to drop and find yourself in the strata underneath this forest. And the strata underneath this forest are tectonic plates that are in motion slowly. And if you look into the plates themselves, into the rocks and stones, they become active. Because now, rather than just the passive viewing of an experience she's created, she's allowed you to interact with it, not by reaching out and touching, but simply by the joy of your gaze. And as you look into an object, it may change in front of you. You might look into a rock and see the forest inside it, and all of a sudden find that your world has become the forest inside this rock. And you can travel further down. And as you travel further down, you now reach the final substructure of a femere, which is a body. It's not necessarily a human body, but it's a body. It's got blood, it's got bones, and it's got sinew, and they're all in motion. And of course, because this has the same constraints as the previous work, this work has to have an end. Change to winter again, which will fade out. But if you're in the body, you'll see the bones slowly come to dust. I went into this work a few weeks ago, and I came out not with the feeling of longing that I had with Osmose, but incredibly joyous, because here was art. It can't be called by any other name. It's art, and it's a joyous art. It's a playful art. It's an art that's inviting you into it, not merely to observe, but to participate in the being, to participate in Char's vision for what's going on in the world. And I think she is the first, and she's really an exemplar. And fortunately, she's had the position and the opportunity to work in this environment, but everything that she's done will be able to do in a Nintendo 64 in 2 years' time. And with good enough tools, a 12-year-old should be able to do it and send it across the internet, and I will be able to stand inside of someone else's head. And this interface, for all of its advancedness, really just comes out of a desire to be simple and effective and in the body, and costs $5. So none of this is rocket science. It's always a question of intent. And her intent and integrity as an artist was to throw away the Cartesian, to throw away the hard edge, to throw away the solid, and replace it with a space that allowed you to be inside of it, that respected you as an individual inside the world of her own creating. So you don't feel like you're a visitor. You feel like you're part of it. That work, those two works, and T-Vision, which we talked about, I believe, this morning, stand out to me as examples of what I call vivogenesis, which is the ability to evoke the positive, the affirming, things that would reify the existence of the self, even if that's a multiple self, things that won't cause it to be pulled apart willy-nilly, things that allow you to stand in the midst of the flow of information and not be overwhelmed by it. And it's certainly my own desire to be able to see other works like that happen, to actually work on works like that, and hopefully to inspire you, if you're working, to work on works like that, to remember your humanity when you work in the virtual, to remember that what you're doing has a profound effect on other people, because you're really getting into other people's heads. And not only that, they're getting into yours. And someone said to me once, it's a good thing that Char is a profoundly ethical person. And you can tell from the quality of her work. If she were Leni Riefenstahl, this would be a very different world. Do you want to take it for a while? Yes.
For those of us who couldn't stand to wait for 2 years to reach the country of videos.
Alright, so that wraps this up for the moment, this layer. I'm not sure how much further I'm going to take this, but I'm liking where it's going. So, That's it for now. It's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Edge in Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting Old Tree B.
Is that our, but I think
Have a good night, Earth.
No, the thing in Linz. Who was on what?